right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. So my name is Gayatri Reddy, and I'm an associate professor of gender and women's studies and anthropology at UIC, and also the co-founder with Anna Guevara, who you'll meet at the end of this program, of the public history multimedia project, Displacements, A People's History of Uptown, that you see flashing on the screen here. And this is a collaborative digital project that traces the long history of people's displacements and the ongoing struggles over land, housing, healthcare, and education stemming from efforts at urban renewal, racial segregation, state and imperial violence in the North Side neighborhood of Uptown. So on behalf of our project, the Displacements Project, the Global Asian Studies Program, and the UIC Library, I welcome you all to this event, and especially a very warm welcome to Helen Shiller, who is coming back to this campus, I don't know, decades after her first visit, maybe for a community control of police event. Oh, no, I don't even know how many years ago now. 1973 in July. June, sorry, June. And I think actually Helen might have taken some of the photographs that are in the library of this event. So a very warm welcome to you, Helen, and we are honored and grateful to celebrate your work, your memoir, Daring to Struggle, Daring to Win. You can buy a copy back there and get it signed by Helen. That was published by Haymarket last year. And the generous donation of Helen's archives to our campus. So thank you for joining us today, Helen, and thank you all for coming out on a beautiful Chicago day. So before we begin, I'd want to offer a brief land acknowledgement. We are holding this event from the University of Illinois at Chicago, which resides on the traditional territories of the three Fire peoples, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, purchased after 2.5 years of open warfare, decades of violent encroachment, and the defeat of a pan-Indian movement to keep settlers out of the Great Lakes region. Illinois is also the territory of the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Anoka, Menominee, Sac, Fox, and their descendants, and it remains home to one of the largest and most diverse urban Native communities in the US. By making a land acknowledgement, we recognize that indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the land that we now occupy, living here long before Chicago was a city and still thriving here today. As we work, live, and play on these territories, we must ask what we can do to right the historic wrongs of colonization and state violence and support indigenous community struggles for self-determination and sovereignty. Even as we make this statement, we recognize that it is but a first step in this process. Also, speaking from a university today, we recognize and acknowledge that decolonizing the university is not a metaphor. As a land-grant university system, the University of Illinois is not only built on indigenous land, but as a stolen gift that keeps on giving, it continues to operate with the funding acquired through the sale of indigenous land. So before we get started, I just want to say a brief, some thank yous. An event like this, as you might imagine, would not have been possible without the labor of many people. So just a few thank yous. To Kenny Allen, our research assistant, to Glenda Henio in Global Asian Studies, our UIC library colleagues, Linda Naru and Andrea Smith. A special thank you to Dean Ballard-Thrower and Dr. Pam Hackbutt-Dean. And a brief shout out to student projects that are displayed at the back of the room. I welcome you all to check them out after the event today. And just very, very briefly, just highlighting a few of these. Anandita Vidyarthi, who is in the audience. Anandita, do you want to wave? All right, okay, she was here briefly before. An artwork based on oral history interviews that Anna and I did with the Winthrop Avenue families. It's called Gold on Winthrop Avenue. Gabrielle Angeles, is she here? Yes. Whose rendition of family photographs from the Winthrop families, segregated to live on just one block, titled Warriors of Winthrop. And so there are a couple of postcards that you can see of their artwork back there. There's also ceramic artivism from a class taught by Anna working with the ceramic artist Nicole Marroquin that sculpted miniature buildings of Uptown that were identified by oral history narrators as key sites marking the experience of gentrification and displacement in the neighborhood. If you're one of the students who worked on these projects, just wave. Right? Nobody here. Oh, there's some students who are shy, but we also have zines that various students produced in classes taught by Anna and me. Zines about the American Indian Center, Chicago Indian Village, Kumba Links, Young Patriots Organization, Jose Chacha Jimenez, Slim Coleman, and other individuals and organizations in Uptown. And if you worked on those projects, students, do you want to raise your hands? Sorta, kinda, okay. And then finally, last but not least, back in the back of the room is a mural, The Heart That Beats, is an Uptown mural that was made by students this past spring in Anna's class, the Glass 300 capstone. And many of those students who worked on that mural are here. Do you want to wave out vaguely? All right. But anyway, so please do check those out. Those are just some of the exhibits and projects that students have worked on. And they are here and will be here you can speak to them at the end of the show. But now I want to introduce our two fearless collaborators who will offer some brief remarks on behalf of the library. Dr. Ria Ballard-Thrower, the Dean of the library, followed by Dr. Pam Hackbart-Dean, who's the interim associate university librarian and head of special collections and the university archives. So, Dean Ballard.
And truly, we will be brief, Pam and I will. This is just a really wonderful opportunity for us to collaborate and to celebrate Helen. We like to say that libraries have a connection with Helen in the past, the present, and the future. And what we mean by that is, of course, in the past, we're celebrating her book that she wrote. She talks about her history, how she became activist in social justice. And so it's really important that as a library, that we celebrate that. We also like to connect with her for the present. Typically, we know when people gather together for events like this, it's because the person you're celebrating is no longer with you, right? And so what we're so happy about is that she's here. You know how they say, give the flowers to the person while they're here, right? So this is the beauty of this, that, that she literally is going to get to hear all these wonderful things, and we get to say thank you for a life well lived, right? While she is still with us. And of course, we are connected with her in the future, because we know she donated her papers to the library, and scholars and students and researchers and all of the people who come visit special collections are going to be able to do some amazing research with the materials that she's donated to us. And so for this, it was just, of course, it just made so much sense that we would collaborate on this very, very special day. And we just want to say thank you for being who you are and what you've done. All right.
Never go after Ria. Here's my suggestions. So I am thrilled to announce, as of today, we have 196 boxes of materials donated by Helen. So we are so happy that Helen added her papers to our holdings, and not only are we documenting Helen and her life, but also activism, culture, history, politics of Chicago in the 20th and 21st century. Her work for equity and social justice fits in with the broader story of activism that Special Collections is trying to document, and Helen's papers are well-suited among our collections that reveal the interconnectedness of human rights work being done in Chicago. So Helen's papers contain letters, photographs, reports, printed materials, digital records, and I'm hoping some scandalous material too, but that's just me. And it really documents her engagement in the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War protests, community and human rights activism, and the records demonstrate Helen's advocacy for diverse, inclusive, affordable housing, her work as editor of Keep Strong and All Chicago City News, as well as her efforts, enormous efforts, painful efforts, possibly, but successfully being able to obtain human rights legislation, and her, among other things, as you read the book, and her service on the Budget Committee, which, God bless, I can't, that's why I was a history major. So we will begin processing Helen's papers later this spring to preserve them and make them accessible to students of all ages, K through community members. We want our students at UIC and researchers from around the world to be able to use the collection. But Helen's papers together follow a remarkable inside look at a very fascinating time in Chicago and U.S. history. So, Helen, we thank you for your invaluable donation. And I want to note that your papers will show how far activism has come while remembering all the sacrifices made and struggles undergone that we enjoy today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ballot Thrower and Dr. Hackbutt-Dean. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest of honor today, who truly does not need any introduction, Helen Shiller. Helen is an author, an activist, an organizer, an archivist, and former alderperson of the 46th Ward, that includes Uptown, and a city council member, as Pam said, for 6 incredible terms from 1987 to 2011. Helen has a BA in history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a master's in public policy from DePaul University. She has been a fearless fighter in the 46th Ward and in the city council, advocating and pushing the city on a range of issues, including the fight for affordable housing, for LGBTQ rights, and Chicago's response to the HIV/AIDS crisis, for one of the strongest stances in the 1990s for disinvestment from apartheid South Africa, in the fight against domestic violence, and so much more. In addition to her work as a politician, Helen has also been an advocate and activist for organizations such as the Intercommunal Survival Committee and Heart of Uptown, to name just a few. And she was also an inveterate chronicler of social movements, designing and printing at Justice Graphics some of the important community newsletters that Pam mentioned, such as Keep Strong and All Chicago City News, among other things. And thankfully for us, she was also an archivist extraordinaire. We are grateful for the 196 boxes of material that Helen is generously donating to the UIC Library, and especially delighted that they will be housed in the Richard Daley Library. So I could go on forever about the many things that Helen has done as an activist, organizer, advocate, alderperson, publisher, archivist, and now author, but I don't want to take any more time away from Helen Shiller, so without further ado, please welcome Helen.
So I actually realized a couple things. One is that there's a million scans that were done of all my budget files, because I left the budget files at City Hall because they were theoretically going to be there available for other aldermen to look at and use, because there's a legislative reference room, big conference room. I don't think anyone has ever gone into it since I left. But apparently when it changed, the guard changed at one point of who was in charge of it, they threw it all out after I left, sometime after I left. So, but it's all digitized on a million things, and that's what I actually realized was not in those boxes, and you need them, because I kept track of the budgets and my notes from every committee for every year that I was alderman. More so, I got more and more information as the years went on, so it's top-heavy. But I think that what that does is, I often asked as many as 500 questions, and but in the end, I was getting responses to them. So it gives additional insight, because I was very specific about asking for all the details of all the line items that are generalized, and otherwise you wouldn't really know what they are. So anyone who wants to actually understand how city government's budgets work, or how the departments work, or how they've changed, you actually can get a pretty good idea through that. So we really need to follow up on that. So I figure we're gonna have a conversation, right? So I thought, instead of just talking off my head for 20 minutes, because then I will go all over the map, as the students know that I just met with, that I would I wanted to read just a very small piece from the beginning of the book, which is the acknowledgments, because I think it is where as opposed to reading the introduction, which is much longer, and I'm going to skip over the specifics for different people, but I think I explain why it is well, or sets a context for why I wrote the book and what we're going to talk about. There are very few things we do in life that are not a product of the hard work and struggles of those that came before us and on whose shoulders we all stand. The justice we seek takes commitment, sacrifice, passion, heart, and so much more. It's not just a cliche to say that failure to know and understand history condemns us to repeat it. But knowing and understanding history is no easy feat, and yet so necessary to any quest for justice. In the United States, this is highlighted by the continuing impact of compromises made centuries ago during the founding of our country. We still struggle for that elusive right of all people to life, liberty, and the pursuit of justice. I know I said justice on purpose. A pursuit made all the more difficult by the codification of slavery and the ensuing legal and cultural embedding of white skin privilege in all facets of our lives. However, justice does not have a color or agenda. It's a universal concept and a universal demand. There's nothing more impactful than this ongoing demand and the protracted struggle it has engendered. We live in a complicated world where loyalties are easily divided and fact is all too often mixed with fiction, making it hard to sort out what the true history is. Truth matters. The task of learning from the past to avoid repeating the actions that have prevented the pursuit of justice for all is impeded when actual facts are perverted. By our nature, human beings make mistakes. That's how we learn. But when an atmosphere is created where mistakes, or the perception of mistakes, are used as tools of attack, an environment is created that engenders the opposite of truth. In fact, it is the kernel that opens the door to the fascism my father warned me to be wary of. During my early forays in electoral politics, my supporters were labeled Shilleristas, an allusion to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and a not-so-veiled attempt to defame me. I bore it as a badge of honor. This book is my nod to all the Shilleristas, and an expression of my pride of being able to make even the smallest of contributions to the ever-ongoing pursuit of justice. While we can't know for sure what the future will bring, through political education, knowing our past, and political action in and out of the electoral arena, the sea will be created as often as necessary to ensure that the arc of justice expands its reach to its ultimate realization. Lest we forget, change does not come without friction, but justice is well worth the trouble. So I want two things. One is that I think we're in a very concerning period of history. And I say that actually with some hope because I think that there is tremendous potential to turn that around. but there's also real dangers or danger signs. And the kind of backward movement and acceptance of even the notion that we should return to the basis of a constitution that is embedded in the protection of slavery as the very foundation both of the government and the economy of our country is really dangerous at a time when we can look back and say we've actually made some progress forward, and now is the time to look at all the things that we're concerned with that aren't working so that we don't keep repeating what we've done in the past, but we're actually going to wholeheartedly and honestly approach new directions and new ways and move forward and go forward in a positive way as opposed to going backward. And I think that that is expressed in this city, and I think it's expressed in what we're facing nationally. And I don't think I have to go into more details about that, but I think that this is a very important moment in time. The other thing I wanted to just add, I was thinking about it when you were, somebody was talking about the library. So when I was, in 1985, Harold Washington asked me to join him as his photographer on a trip to Israel and Rome. And we went to, when we were in Israel, we went to the West Bank, and I think it's in the book, I can't remember, I think it was Bethlehem, the city of Bethlehem, and we met with the mayor. And he had a picture on the wall of a visit he had made to Chicago, to the mayor's office, and it was a picture of him and Richard J. Daley. Harold loved that. He thought it was hysterical. He asked the mayor if we could have me take a picture of the two of them sitting with a photograph in between them, holding it, which I did. Unfortunately, on the one hand, I don't actually physically have that photo, of the negative, and I can't find my copy of it, but it is, I donated all those pictures to the Harold Washington collection at the Harold Washington Library, and I can get anything I want back from them. So I would like to get that picture, that negative, and for us to print it and put that in the conference room as part of the Richard J. Daley Library. All right. I will get that to you. So I think we should go to conversation, no? Can we do that? Yay.
All right, thank you, Helen. And you might notice the picture on the flyer for this event is also, the backdrop is Daley, with a photograph we took when you came to donate the archives. So now it is my pleasure to also introduce our wonderful moderators for the next portion of our event. Harini Marchadi is a fourth-year UIC student, double majoring in biology and history, and minoring in global Asian studies and Spanish for the professions. Just a few things that Harini is doing. She's on the pre-med track. Harini is passionate about social justice and hopes to integrate her humanities education into her medical career. Her involvement includes Global Med at UIC, Medical School Equity Initiative, and the Society of Future Physicians. She is very excited for the opportunity to participate in this event. And Julie Cottle has worked for years as a researcher, educator, activist, and organizer in a variety of universities, human rights, and labor organizations in Ecuador, Mexico, and the United States. She's currently a resident of Uptown, where she's been a member of the 46th Ward Aldermanic candidate Angela Clay's steering committee for the past year. So if I could invite the two of you up to the table. We will have a moderated conversation for a short while before we throw it open to the audience. So.
I just.
Just getting prepared. So just to start off with, could you kind of tell the story of how you got to Chicago? Because you're not a native of Chicago. So how you got to Chicago and how you got involved in Uptown specifically and why you decided to stay there?
Most of the people that I know who live in Chicago actually came from somewhere else and didn't expect to stay here very long. I think I'm one of them. So I was, when I left the University of Wisconsin, I went to organize in Racine, Wisconsin. And when we were in Racine, I'm trying to make this short. There were initially 4, and then there were 2 of us, and then we recruited a bunch of people, and we met them, and our job was, we had left Madison, we had been involved in the anti-war movement, we had been involved in the student strike for, Black-led student strike for Black Studies, and we were intentionally entering the real world to organize, to put our bodies where our mouths were, basically. And we met people in Milwaukee who were part of what was then called the National Committees to Combat Fascism. They were the pre-situation, I guess, to become a chapter of the Black Panther Party. And we worked with them. We got Black Panther papers with them. We sold them in Racine. We've developed survival programs, and our focus is really to organize white people, but we were always in a very diverse mixed community. We always were people who were very poor. After a few years, we were in touch with people in Chicago, and ultimately, after Fred Hampton was killed, we were in touch with the Rockford chapter of the Black Panther Party, who actually did political education with us on a pretty regular basis, and we got our papers from them at that time until we came to Chicago a couple of years later. In 1972, Slim Coleman came to Racine, and Bobby Rush went to East St. Louis and recruited the white people that were working respectively with the Black Panther Party from each place to come to Chicago and to work on a organization they were creating that was called the Intercommunal Survival Committee. We were working under the direction of the Black Panther Party. The point was we worked under the direction of the Black Panther Party to organize white people to join the Black-led struggle for liberation. So that's how I got to Chicago. And stayed here throughout the 70s. We worked closely with the Black Panther Party. But the first thing we did, we did a clothing program and a few things like that, and we had a home distribution route for the Black Panther Party paper. We got very involved in the election to dump Edward Hanrahan, who was the state's attorney that was responsible for sending the police to murder Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. And we had first big mass activity we had was a rally at the Aragon Theater in Uptown, where we had a rally against police brutality and to establish community control. We distributed 3,000 bags of groceries and weren't really sure what the response was going to be. We did a lot of organizing for it, and the place was full. We distributed all the groceries, and there's a couple of people here from the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. I just want to acknowledge them, and Stan on the left was at the rally. And then Henry was from East St. Louis, and Diana is Henry's wife and was a very important part of the health clinic that was started by the Black Panther Party after Fred's death. Did I answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
What were some of the greatest challenges you faced as an activist, an organizer, and alderperson in building collective power? For example, what were some of the specific challenges that the survival programs that you were involved in Uptown faced in building a movement?
Well, it's complicated. We were a group of 20 people, give or take. Cadre 24/7. We collectivized our resources, and we really sort of believed that if we identified something we needed to do, because that was what was needed in the community, the first thing we did wasn't where can we get the money or who do we have to write a a request from or an application for or anything like that. We just said, okay, we're going to do it. We'll find a way. What needs to be done and how do we go about it? So we had a problem-solving perspective, but we also had the leadership of the Black Panther Party who was doing who really showed us a method of work that allowed us to be able to take advantage of the time and that we were putting into it. But we functioned collectively, but we had a structure. We had our own central committee, if you will, that interacted directly, both with us, but also in our relationship with the Black Panther Party in Illinois and elsewhere. And what we did based on the 10-point platform and program, which when I wrote the book, I realized when I got to the end of it that how much I had learned in terms of method of work and just clear perspective and theory, really, to be able to, how much a guide that was in everything I did, because the practice that we had in the 70s really gave me a method of work that was so very helpful when I became an alderman in terms of really establishing ways in which to really hear directly from people, look at how their issues that related to the city were playing out, what worked, what didn't work, where we really had to attempt to get policies made or action change in the way things were done. And that was true in so many ways, but because we were always dealing with day-to-day survival, and boy, there were a lot of survival issues in Uptown in the 70s. And so many ways in which violence entered people's lives. It wasn't, people, besides the fact that it was a community that was really targeted by John Wayne Gacy and Larry Eiler and several other mass murderers, it was also a place where there was a lot of violence between the community and the police, and where there was a lot of violence because of health conditions that were result of the poor housing conditions that were there, whether it was arson that killed people or collapses of the elevators or salmonella poisoning because the plumbing was so bad, or pneumonia and other things that people got, or lead poisoning as a result of either not having heat or having all that lead that was not being taken care of. There were so many ways, or the failure to acknowledge the level of violence that existed against women. That was often often a result of relationship issues, and just the failure to really address so many of these things in terms of city policy. In fact, really, that the city had an attitude of these were invisible people, let's keep them that way, needed to be changed. But it was the issue of public safety, the issue of quality of life was so impacted in all these different ways that that really was a very big part of how I approached a lot of what we did. And what I had learned, I think, was that especially in politics or in anything, it's easy to be superficial. It's easy to come up with a simple answer because you're telling people what they want to hear. But that doesn't mean you've actually found a real solution to the problem or that you've even identified the problem. So I began to develop a perspective that if we really want to solve a problem, then we really need to identify the most serious manifestation of that problem, who is the most affected. Now, it's not always the same people, and it's often people with fewer resources, or people who are being targeted because of their race or their ethnicity or whatever, their gender, but it's not necessarily always that or the same. So you have to figure out where is the most serious manifestation, who's most seriously affected, what would be a solution to that or a set of solutions, and then which of those not only works for them, but keep going broader out to make sure you don't have negative collateral impacts. I experienced again and again knee-jerk reactions to identify solutions to problems that were implemented without those considerations. And so that it might have solved a problem over here, maybe, but it might have made something much worse over there, or didn't even touch what the issues were over there. So I kind of came up with a mantra of do no harm. I thought that was a pretty good idea in medicine. I thought maybe it was a good idea in politics or in government. But I really tried to use that method of work. And I think that a lot of learning to do that, or even the thought of doing that, came from my experience in the organizing in the 70s.
Thank you. You frequently bring up the notion of a sea to swim in.
Yes.
Could you talk a
favorite
little bit
concept.
about what that means?
Yeah, I will. This is my new favorite concept. People always have great expectations when they really work hard for someone, especially if you get them elected or work in a campaign, whether, you know, a political campaign or even a campaign around an issue, and then get very disappointed because they can't do everything they want them to do, or it doesn't do quite what they want to have done. And my experience was one that it was always very helpful to have, this is a negative, I learned this negatively, maybe I should tell you how I learned it, but to have, sort of have a sea to swim in, have people that have really organized for the issue that you're addressing, so that you are not only buoyed by that organizing, but you're also held accountable by it. And so I always welcome people coming, especially from my left, which really most people didn't understand. Most of my colleagues didn't understand it. I loved it because it meant it gave me room in which I could maneuver. And it gave me the opportunity to be able to, well, I'll give you an example. We were doing the anti-apartheid ordinance, and I wanted to, it was right around the time that Nelson Mandela was being released, and George Bush was talking about, the first George Bush was talking about lifting sanctions against South Africa. And it was premature because they were just talking, first they were just talking about releasing Mandela, but then they released him, but they weren't doing anything yet about changing apartheid. And the point was apartheid had to go, they needed a new constitution, people were arguing there for one person, one vote. And so the last thing that needed to happen in terms of accomplishing those goals from the perspective of South Africa was to lift sanctions and let the government off the hook. So I was meeting, this was an issue for me. I had spent time in Southern Africa, and I published a couple issues of Zimbabwe News, which was the magazine of ZANU, which was one of the groups, ended up being the leading group that formed the new government there. And I knew, and I had published that book, several issues of the magazine that had gone back to Zimbabwe. So in publishing it, and I did the typesetting, the layout, I didn't do the writing, I learned a lot about what was going on there and was somewhat horrified by the situation. And then spent some time there at the end of 1989 and was really outraged by the impact that South Africa government, the apartheid government, was having on the rest of the region. So I decided that I was going to work with a group of people in Chicago who were opposed to apartheid, and around the country, actually. I needed the financial help from the experts on international finance to figure out what we could do here. And it became clear we had 3 institutions that had investments in South Africa, financial institutions. We wanted them to divest, and the goal was to write an ordinance that would prevent them from being part of the city's municipal depository system, which they make a lot of money off of, and it's very important for them to be as a bank. And we were going to, if they didn't divest in 6 months, they were going to be taken off of that. And 2 of the 3 banks ultimately did divest. But during the course of doing this, not only did I have to do 17 versions of this before the aldermen who had been the architects of Harold Washington's opposition several years earlier, Verdoliak and Burke, not only did I have to do that, but they rewrote the ordinance. And they rewrote it thinking that if they just did a really good set of definitions in the front of the ordinance, that I would not notice that the rest of the ordinance had no teeth. But I did. So I kept their definitions, rewrote the ordinance, and made it have teeth, the things that they had there. So they were kind of in a bind because they were touting how great this was, and I just made the second part of it relate to the first part. But there were a group of aldermen that were concerned that their version was different than mine, and that therefore we were giving something up. So they kept pushing for more and more from my left. And Burke thought that meant that I was going to cave, and he just had to push me a little further. So at the very last minute, he suggested some change in the financial language that I didn't understand. So I didn't know if it was really going to hurt or help or not. I assumed he thought it would hurt. So I got on the phone, I took a break, asked them to do recess, and I got on the phone to the person in New York who could tell me the answer, read her what they were saying, and she said, oh, that's all bullshit. It has nothing to do with anything. It's nothing. That's a meaningless phrase. Go for it. They're just trying to mess with you. So the other folks weren't so sure, and so they voted in committee against it, but that gave me great credibility to ultimately be able to get it passed on the full city council. And no one, the regulars, the old guard, just didn't understand why I wasn't upset. And didn't understand that I really welcomed this. And the other guys were like, we're really sorry, Helen. And I'm like, no, keep it up. Because it was really a helpful dynamic. I think you have to have the dynamic, even if it's a negative one, as long as you can let it run off your back, to be able to really to have a real objective way to make sure that you're really looking at all these different sides and understanding the truth of the matter in order to be able to get at the truth of the matter. So I always welcome that kind of thing, but to me that represented one aspect of this bigger picture of really the best thing ever is to have a sea to swim in. And we had it then, and that sea, because it was more and more, Nelson Mandela came to the U.S. He didn't come to Chicago, but he was in Detroit, he was in New York, it was all over the news. We got more stuff over the news because we were, doing media stuff around the ordinance, and it created momentum because people they were excited that there was going to be this change. And that was the sea I'm talking about. And I think you need that in every circumstance. When Daley decided to privatize the daycare, the Head Start program, and put it into private institutions, he was able to get support for that by saying he was putting it into not-for-profits, so he got all the not-for-profits to support it. Now, they had functioned side by side with the Board of Ed before then, doing daycare. And I was really concerned because I was fearful whenever we've privatized stuff in the public sector, we end up undermining other aspects of the public sector. And I was very concerned, and I think it's played out that that's happened with education a lot over the last 20, 30 years. So friends of mine came to me and said, do a resolution about this and we'll come and testify against it. And I said, great. So I did it. They didn't come and testify. 100 people came from the not-for-profit organizations that were going to benefit, and they were friends, but we disagreed on this, and they're the only ones that testified. And of course, there was no way in which to then move that resolution forward or any kind of change. So that's both a positive and a negative example of why you need a sea to swim in.
It's interesting. So, when in your initiatives as alderperson, can you maybe provide us some examples of the ways that community organizations do form part of that sea?
Well, so there have always been citywide and in uptown organizations that have dealt with housing, affordable housing. And so their activism is part of creating that sea. The people who do the work are always in a situation where they have to play somewhat of a political game, but they also have a very clear objective. So the ones that are good have figured out how to do both, to be able to create a situation where they can continue to be really critical in the sense of, not in a negative sense, but in the sense of making sure that we're actually doing what needs to be done or demanding more be done because the need is there. But also being able to continue to get resources that they need from the city to function. So that's true with housing, it's true with homeless shelters, it's true with the domestic violence shelters. It's a double-edged sword, but it's really important that there be a broader support or a collectivity between them in order for that to continue. In Uptown, since the day I can remember and I arrived there were always those folks that were always organizing to get rid of the social service agencies. They said, that's why we have poor people here. And the rest of us said, no, that we have the social services here because the people who live here need them in order to be able to improve their quality of life. And so that was a big divide, but it was constantly the struggle, constantly the struggle.
Thank you.
So you have in your time been both like a leader, an activist, an organizer. You've played a lot of different roles, but all of them are quite different from each other. So what were some of your experiences of the differences between being a leader, being an organizer, being a politician, and how did those roles overlap and not overlap?
So if you're an activist, you don't have responsibility to govern. Your responsibility is to challenge, to, well, it depends, I mean, your responsibility is to really create that seat to swim in, but I think that you also have a responsibility to show how it's done. I mean, one of the most impactful things about the Black Panther Party was that if you look at all the things that they did, so the Breakfast for Children program, now there's breakfast in the schools. The free health clinics, now you have the federally funded clinics. The sickle cell anemia investigation, identification, testing, information, dissemination of information, acknowledgement of the disease would never have gone the way, I mean, it was ultimately and primarily and firstly identified by the Black Panther Party and proven that not only was it a real disease, but that there was something you could do about it. So again and again, the survival programs were not just about, they weren't service programs, they weren't programs in the sense of we're going to do something for you. There were programs that came out of the needs of a community that were designed to create the opportunity for whoever was going to benefit from it to be able to better stand on their own 2 feet and grow and develop into their fullest potential. That was the goal in every single case. And it's a very different perspective. And I think it's a very important one.
And kind of what part of that transition from being an activist and working and organizing
Okay,
to politics was
well,
hardest?
that's kind of the transition. Okay, so the activist, as an activist, I would demand that the person in government would do what they had to do, what they were supposed to do. As a person in government, I would expect to be challenged and to act differently than the person had acted who I'd confronted before I was an alderman. And part of how my approach to that came from the different examples I've given today.
So we are here because you donated so many of your records to the UIC Library, the daily library. So why do you think it's important to have these documents and to document collective action and collective struggle?
Well, so I mentioned the budget stuff, and first of all, I think history is really important, and history is reflected by those who write it. I mentioned earlier the apartheid thing. What I didn't mention, I did when I was in class with earlier, was that I was really upset about I used to teach the Constitution class. We were invited to teach one at any school we wanted each year. I was taught it at the middle school in Uptown before it became a high school, and I always taught the 8th grade in January. And I initially just used it as a vehicle to say, this is how the Constitution was written, and these are all the best thing about it was that it opened the door to realize the vision of the Declaration of Independence, which it didn't do when it was formed, and why it didn't do it when it was formed, and all the gains that people had fought for and organized and got changed. So that was kind of what I was doing. And the year that I came back from Southern Africa and then heard Nelson Mandela was being released, I decided to do a PowerPoint, I guess it was a PowerPoint, I don't know if we had that there, but something like that, on apartheid, because they were demanding a constitution of one person, one vote. So it had gave me a whole way to have a conversation about a constitution. And during that time, I got really upset and frustrated by the lack of any information in that 8th grade class's history book, about slavery or about the history of slavery. In fact, it only mentioned the word slavery once in one phrase about the African slave trade. So the teacher was there with me 100%. He said, look, we don't get to choose our own books. We have to take it from, whatever. So whatever the board tells us, this is your choice. And they're all the same. So I objected to it. You were there, I talked about this. I objected to it and they went up in arms. The teachers, first the librarian and the other teachers, why is she interfering in what we're teaching and why she's interfering politically. So I think this is kind of what's happening. It's the same thing that's happening elsewhere in the country, right? And that really, and at that particular point in time, that was the status quo. You can't raise questions. You can't tell us what to teach, and we're not going to teach that. To me, it's really important that the truth be told. What is the actual history? How was everyone impacted, not just the people who wrote the history? So hopefully, in these files, a lot of the files, there's 30 of those boxes, or maybe 40, are literally what I called our building files. So every time we did anything for any building in Uptown, and we did something with almost every building, and there are a lot of multi-unit buildings, so you can imagine, it's in their file for that building. So you can it includes not just zoning information or building information, but also who got a license to open up some kind of business or there's a lot of stuff in there. And I think that's just really interesting raw information. There's 2 boxes which I've not even looked at since I closed the office, so I'm not sure what they are, but I know they're letters. That my staff had put somewhere, whatever. There's a few boxes of my schedules, although that might have been scanned. So they may not be in the boxes anymore. But they'll be here because I'll send the scans. But it's a lot of raw material. I think that you can get a sense of what was going on at the time and what the things were. I may or may not, I don't have access to opening it up, the programs that we used every day for our service requests, but I have multiple copies of some of those requests. So you can actually see the things that people were calling us about. It was an ACT program, so it's everything. It's what they were calling about, who they spoke to, what that person did, when they called them back, what the result was. And we had a policy that you had to get back to everybody, no matter who called, you had to get back to them within 48 hours, even if you didn't have an answer. And so all of this is kind of documented, and who they had to deal with the city, and probably when they, I always had a lot of women on my staff. We were all completely disregarded by some of the most important committees the departments we had to deal with, like the Department of Transportation is really important. They have everything to do with the street, and the Streets and Sand didn't, and both of those departments really were not too inclined to talk to any women, let alone young women. And so every now and then we developed, some of this is reflected, and they would send me notes saying, memos, I can't get through, they won't respond to me. So we would concoct ways in which they would, talk about how they would act like they were really scared because I would really get down on them if they didn't do it. We figured out all sorts of scenarios to get them to give them the answers they wanted. And worst case scenario, I'd bring it up at budget, which no one wanted. So when they figured that out, they started giving us answers. But we had to maneuver all that, and I think a lot of that is there. Well, I think that's interesting because it tells you a little bit about how government worked. And then there are all the resolutions and everything else. So I think it's important to have the history available and people can look at it and hopefully, I don't know, maybe get something out of it, maybe not, maybe it's just, boring. I don't know.
And was there a time in your own career where you kind of looked back on similar archives or looked back at documentations of previous struggles and used that to inform your own kind of work, or?
I was always more inclined to do what, when I went to the School of New Learning at DePaul in mid-2000s. And the way that works is that you write competencies. You write your own curriculum and you do competencies. And I chose that because I was very busy. And so I figured I could just do stuff and then write about what I'm doing because it was related to almost every competency. The problem I was having was that I never had time to really do it because once I started on something, but then when I was done, I always had a list of about 100 things that I was working on. So we figured out how to do it, and we did it through a lot of interviews and stuff like that, but it gave me an opportunity not just to reflect on what we had actually done, but in some cases, I did a whole thing on TIFs and studied what everyone in the country was doing in every state and what all their laws were. So that was probably the best example of that. But for the most part, my role was really just to get things in a file and put it away so that we could use it again if we needed to. And that's what I ended up with. And then Paul Siegel was doing a PhD. He was the head of the Black Lung Association. And he took a bunch of stuff that I had all those years and further organized it when he was doing his PhD and then gave it back to me. And then when I was writing the book, I further organized it or disorganized it. They're going to have to get from the database that I put together. But otherwise, I really was focused on what I did day to day.
We do have time if you want to go on to the sustainability.
We're running out of time.
Oh, no, we have plenty of time. Don't worry about it. Yeah. So we had a question about sustainability and longevity. So how do you create change long-term and keeps movements viable and vibrant beyond just your direct involvement in them? How do you make sure that you create change that lasts and can be carried forward to future generations?
I don't know if I know the answer to that. I think a few things are true. I think that any institution, at some point, when it becomes an institution, then becomes something that is going to, whose main priority is to sustain itself. That's the danger. And I think, so it's very important always to remember why you're there and for people to be, it's very important to have sort of challenges from a perspective of democracy or democratization. I think that's true in government, I think it's true in unions, I think it's true in business, or at least any kind of, well, I mean, I think it's true in business, it's a different way you deal with it, but any public entity for sure, or anything where the public interacts. And that's true of movements. And movements are not always active. I mean, we used to say all the time, quantitative change leads to qualitative change. You can do something over and over and over and over again before you get to the point where you really see the result of it. And you see it when there's a qualitative change. Another way to look at it, or the way I've often looked at it, is we do what we do because it needs to be done, and it's part of impacting the world, but it's also part of really changing people's minds. It's part of exploring what works and what doesn't work. But sometimes it's just really just the grind of you're talking to someone, you're canvassing, you're selling papers, you're selling magazines, you're going to meetings to get other people involved, you're doing whatever you're doing, but it doesn't seem like much. And then there's something happening that's dynamic. And you have an opportunity and it's becoming an historic moment, even if you don't actually realize it, but you have the opportunity to be part of that. And you you get an opportunity to make that choice. And that's very dynamic and very exciting. But in between, it can be, a little demoralizing. Right. So a long-term perspective, a broad perspective, outside of yourself, being able to look at things, outside yourself, and then from your point of view, from someone else's and back to yours, I think is really important, both individually, but also collectively, even if it's not always with the same people. But with people you engage in, you want to be moving forward. You want to be able to see what worked and what didn't work, what's not working, and what do we need to do? What are our goals? Where do we have allies? And to move forward in a way that really allows us to change the landscape. That's the goal, I think. But also to broaden the discussion. I'm particularly focused these days on this whole thing about the police because I think that everyone in the city wants public safety. And yet we don't acknowledge that we have different experiences or policies, don't acknowledge that we have different experiences with the way in which we face public safety, and that it's not just about crime. If you look at it only as it's a crime problem rather than public safety, it's very narrow, and you then attribute it to somebody else to take care of it, and if they are not necessarily trained or able or know that situation, it's going to be chaos. And if you're reacting, then what we tend to do is we put the same people who are in the most danger of a short future directly in contact with the people whose job it is to almost guarantee that they're going to have a short future, because you create a circumstance where there's an assumed conflict. We've got to be able to separate out what are the issues we have to deal with and identify the best way for each one of them without the preconceived notions of there's only one way to do this. And without the inherent judgment that goes and says, this is the way it is, they're right and they're wrong. I don't think there's a person in this room who can honestly say they've never broken a law. And especially, and if you're young and you're figuring out what you can and can't do, based on who you are, it may be something that, that's just kid stuff, or, oh, that's a criminal, we need to do something about it. So there's something wrong with that. And so we have to get to the point where all things are equal. But in order to do that, that means people have to be able to have food, they have to be able to have decent housing, they have to be able to have an education that really teaches them their true history. They have to be able to have a quality of life that doesn't put them always in conflict with someone with a gun who then they're always afraid of, and where you can never get anything, who's not solving any problems for you, or who you may want to have solve a problem, but where do you go? You don't know what to do. We've got to fix that, because we do need to have a situation where you can have order in a society. But it needs to be order that's not dependent upon disorganizing one person's life in order to get order for another. It has to be across the board, and we have to figure that out. But we can't if we say we have to keep doing everything the way we've always done it. That's my problem.
So one more thing I kind of wanted to mention, because I think your response speaks a lot to the kind of ability to be flexible and keep your own ego out of your activism. And one thing that kind of in your book that I think kind of speaks to that was the student strike for Black Studies at UW-Madison. You mentioned that there were a lot of white students who were very upset because they, weren't in charge of the movement for once, because it wasn't about them. And so I kind of wanted to ask about the dynamics of being a white organizer, working with the Black Panther Party and working for Black liberation, and kind of how you managed your own boundaries of, not overstepping and not making it about you, quote unquote, but still really committing yourself to the struggle.
I never thought anything was ever about me, so it wasn't really hard. I was very comfortable in the background. The first time I had to speak when I first ran for alderman was like one of the more dramatic moments of my life. So for me, it was, I think once you're elected and people start treating you differently, and let me tell you, they do, even your closest friends, I think it's really important to be very conscious about that possibility. And for me, I had a kind of a thing and a mantra about prestige of power all the time in the 70s when I was organizing. So for me, I would just remember that this was how I felt then, I should still feel it now. So I worked really hard at that. But I think that that's a real thing. It's the way we organize as a society. We constantly put people on pedestals and then we knock them down, but we treat them differently and then they act differently. And that's just kind of a human dynamic, but I think that we need to be able to hold ourselves more accountable and each other more accountable, and in a real way. I think a lot of times we talk about it very superficially because every time when we talk about ethics, somebody is not going to be able to do what they currently do. And what they're currently doing is currently legal. And if you're going to change it and make it illegal, they don't necessarily want to go there, because then they have to shift what they're doing. Maybe they don't get a benefit. Maybe they can't earn money the way they've been doing it, whatever. And so you have this dynamic where the same people that are making the laws, which is kind of our system, right, are also directly impacted by it. And we don't really focus on how do we really figure that out and address it. I think that's a big part of the problems we've had in the city, especially with the history of the old democratic machine and the way things just sort of people got used to doing stuff. Harold Washington said when he was elected that there were he said institutional racism and institutional corruption were the two most important things that we needed to address in the city, but that would take a long time. It would require people really change, it would require an internal change. And that would take at least 20 years. And he committed to do 20 years. Well, he gave us 5, but he was right. And I'm not sure 20 years was enough, but it would have been a good start.
Yeah, so now we're going to open up the floor to audience questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can come up to that mic right there. Please state your name and your affiliation before you ask your question, and keep questions short if possible so that we can give as many people an opportunity to ask a question within the time that we have as possible. Hi again.
So we talked a little bit about police misconduct. Hi, I'm Beatrice. Major in sociology, minor in global Asian studies. So in class we talked a little bit about misconduct within like the police, but I want to get a little bit into misconduct within the healthcare system.
Yep.
You talked a little bit about how some people would be dismissed just because of the color of their skin or their racial background. I don't want to say we should police the doctors as well, but is there a way to like put in a system where if people feel like they're being mistreated, or to inform them beforehand, like, if this happens, then you are being mistreated? Is there a way we can do that without kind of interrupting the doctor-patient relationship? Maybe like building something where they give a review of their doctor after their diagnosis or whatever. But like, I think that would be an idea, but at the same time, I don't want it to be like a thing where it's like they feel like their privacy is being.
So I think that what I was talking about, the example I gave before about sickle cell anemia, I think that the most important thing about that was the campaign to make it a publicly acknowledged disease that deserved not only a response, but for which there was one. Because I used to say, either it didn't exist, or if it did exist, you have it and nothing can be done about it. It was kind of the same thing we said about AIDS. It's, we have, I think, to look at what it takes to really provide information to people that's understandable about an acknowledgement of the physical problems people have. There's a whole series of fibromyalgia was not acknowledged as even being something for real most of my life. And then all of a sudden it became something, I mean, it's one of the reasons you get a medical marijuana card now. I think that there's a lot of information that is really available now that wasn't available before, but not necessarily in a way that regular folks who aren't doctors or in the health industry can necessarily understand it. So I think that information is really important, and having that really accessible, and having it accessible in more than just researching it on the internet where you don't know actually who's telling you the information. Often it's someone who's trying to sell you something. But I also think it's important that we learn how to ask questions, that we bring people with us. I know for myself, in my experience, that very few people are able to go to the doctor's office when they have a problem and remember everything they want to ask, and then remember the answer to what they got, and to know whether they really got an answer until they leave, and think about it and say, oh my God. I think people need to be able to bring advocates with them, whether it's a friend or a family member or someone who's actually knows the stuff. To me, that would be the biggest thing, that if I want to bring someone with me, that's not a violation of my HIPAA rights. Let me bring them in and help me. And most physicians will let you do that. And then you get to pick your physician. But the biggest problem, I think, with the healthcare is two things. One is that public health is a really important thing. We should know that from the pandemic. And yet, it's not, the pandemic maybe was an eye-opening so that there's more attention to public health in our state and our city, but that's always been a struggle. We've eliminated the visiting nurses. We've eliminated a lot of ways in which people were able to get access to public health because there were people there ready to do that, and we needed to improve it, but that was an important part of the structure. But the other thing is that and that there's a collective responsibility to deal with a lot of stuff. So there's a lot around that. There's a lot of advertising about how you need to get flu shots and things like that, but I think that public health is a really important concept. The other thing is that the health system, to me, looks to me like the health system has become so privatized that, that it's not based on, it's really based on, the care you get is really related more often than not to how much money you're willing or able to spend on it. So I'm very concerned about this new medical advantage, what's it called? The Advantage plans, because they're really, they're kind of like the 70s version of damping down what you have access to while saying you're going to have access to a lot more. And I think that it's shown, there have been some studies that have shown people are getting less care than they did before, but they're being promised a lot more. So we'll have to see how that plays out, but it wasn't defined from the perspective of what people need. It identified the things people need, and they say they're giving them all these things like additional, like eye care and hearing aids and things that we all really should have part of the health system, but which are in fact not necessarily available to you once you're in there. They are, but they tell you how much, they tell you by whom. You can't, I believe that you're limited, and I'm concerned about that. And I think it might be a real problem. So I think we have to look at how people are really affected in the interaction, but it's a systemic question. So it's not about the individual interaction, I think best. I think it's really important that people bring advocates with them. I don't think you need to legislate that, but you need to make sure that if it's a HIPAA question, it's up to you. But I do think there are some issues with the new structures around Medicare, which is the only really public health, publicly supported health. It's for people on Medicare and Medicaid. So in the state, that's for people who are eligible by income for Medicaid, and then otherwise Medicare is for anybody who is over 65. Or maybe not quite everyone, but most people. But you still have to pay for a lot of it, and if you don't go to the Advantage plan, for those of you who are not a Medicare, it only pays for 80% of your care, so that it's very expensive unless you get additional insurance, so that which you have to pay for every month. The Advantage programs are saying, we can now cover you, you don't have to pay that extra amount every month, and you might not even have to pay as much as you're paying into Medicare, so you're going to get some money back, and we can do all these extra things for you. And my question is, how can they get less money and give you more service? Doesn't sound right to me, and so I'm not trustful. But we'll see.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful responses so far, and I'm super short. I think you can hear me. And for giving us your time today. My name is Michael Oliveros. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am a student of Global Asian Studies Department, but I'm also standing here as someone that is an aspiring archivist, and also as someone that comes from a community of a lot of resistance, but also pain. And the more that I learn about our histories, whether collectively or individually, the more in my own personal life I've had to reckon with grief and with pain and with trauma that has happened. So my question is, how do you exercise this discipline of revolutionary hope in the wake of what seems to be this endless struggle and pain and despair?
Carefully. I think that mental health is a real thing. I think that people experience a huge amount of trauma in all the ways I've mentioned every day, and it affects them, and we don't acknowledge it enough. I think we're better at it today than we were 20, 30 years ago. And so I think personal care is really important. And we need to make sure, regardless of people's circumstances, and some people, really do have to don't necessarily feel like and objectively maybe even have the time for personal care, but I think it's really important, and we need to find a way to make sure it's available to everyone. In all its forms, whether it's, talk, acupuncture, massages, I don't care. But it's the things that people need in order to be able to get back to themselves.
What's the whole name? Okay. Hi, I'm Natalie Bennett, the director for UIC's Women's Leadership and Resource Center. And I'm so happy that I made myself leave the office and come over here.
thank you.
This, I think, made my week, my month probably. As I was listening to you, and I will read the book because I think it's a necessary read for Chicago especially, and right now. I was listening to you and kind of thinking about the incredible kind of persistence and the continuities in terms of your own progressive thinking over time. And there's something that you've always held on to. I guess the question for me, thinking right now, 2023, how have you changed? How have you changed over time? How have you kind of made intentional changes or not to kind of maintain and hold on to that kind of progressive vision?
Well, we all change, right? We learn and we move forward. I think that Nancy Jefferson, who was a community activist on the West Side, told me once, she gave me a definition of a plumb line, which was very helpful for me to think about kind of what you're talking about. So she said, we have to have a plumb line just like a house needs a plumb line. It's what keeps it, straight and gives it structure. It's the core of its structure. And so that's been very helpful for me, and I am going like this because I feel like that's my plumb line. And I know what's there. And so I go back to that always. I have a thing about I think it's important to put yourself in other people's shoes. And at one point when I was an alderman, that I would meet with pretty much anyone that would ask to meet with me. And when developers came in to meet with me, I had one requirement, which was that they give me 15 minutes of their time to talk about possible ideas for affordable housing, which sometimes I had to push a little bit because, it wasn't really what they wanted to think about. But I got great ideas from people, but I mostly was able to, I felt like I had to put myself in their shoes, so I also tried to figure out what their shoes were to put myself into in order to see their perspective, in order to even understand what they were saying, or to evaluate that from my own. So it was like going into their perspective and then coming out and looking at it myself. And I realized, actually, George, who's mentioned in the book, really helped me do what I realized. He always kind of debriefed me after these meetings, and I realized that, or I went to him for that, not really very consciously, but over time realized that he was helping me come out of that. That once I needed to come out of that to come back to who I was, and it became a very conscious kind of thing. But it gave me huge insight into ideas that I wouldn't have thought about otherwise, but also into why people were doing what they were doing, so it could help me understand how I could move that along. Because in many cases, it wasn't just that they were on a different page, they were in a different universe in terms of what they thought was important and concerning. And yet what they were doing was impacting people's lives in a very real way. So how do you handle that? How do you get a handle on that? And I think that was really important. It was an important piece of how I move forward. What I learned was kind of what we talked about before, that there really is a difference between being, on the one hand, being outside government, actively engaged in defining problems that people had and what needed to be done about it, was from the perspective, this is what we need. Governing was, how do I find a way to advance that? So it's a little bit different. And I had to do it and then understand it in order to be able to encourage other people to keep doing what they're doing, but also not to be so antagonistic to what I was doing when they actually agreed with me. I just wasn't able to do everything they wanted because it physically wasn't possible. I kind of always believed that anything is possible. We just have to figure out how to do it. But, sometimes you get to a point where you really can't go any further, or something's really not working, or things have really changed, or the world around you changed, and you have to figure out what to do, or you're completely encircled, and what do you do? And so I would have this thing where I would, literally go like that, as a way of just saying, that's it. and just blowing it up, and now we're going to start over and figure out what we can do, or break out of the encirclement, and now let's figure out what to do. So those are things that became helpful and handy in order to be able to actually live truthful to the plumb line, which for me was always a world without judgment that provided people truly with the things that they needed in order to be able to realize their fullest potential. That's the goal. As my father said, and that might not happen for a very long time. You got to get everyone on board to be able to get there, which is not a short order. It's probably a generations or two or three or four. But I think that I think that's really important. But I also, the other piece I want to say about that is that I think that renewal is really critical. I think we have to be constantly reinvigorating and rethinking what we do, who we are, if we're doing what we need to do, is it appropriate in these circumstances? Be open to change. I think it's our tendency to be more cautious as we get older. I think that we should celebrate the activism of youth because that's a very special thing, and it's even, we might want to be activists and continue to be when we get older, but it's a different animal than the activism of youth who can just go forward without half of the concerns that we have because they don't yet have children, or even if they do, they've got lots of support, or even if they don't, they have passion and not afraid in a way that we might be as we get older. And so I think it's really important to pave the way or build the support, the C for that. So our role may change some. There's a lot of things I can't do that I used to be able to do, but it's really important that young people are encouraged, or other people are encouraged who can do it, to do it, and with direction or whatever else, and to just be available. So I think you learn and hopefully pass on what you learn, and I think you may become less able to be as creative or as open or carefree as you might. It's a funny term for somebody who's really passionate, but you know what I mean. And I think that our roles may change, but our heart doesn't. And if it does, we should be challenged.
Yeah, I think we do have time for one more question. So.
Helen, thanks for your life's work and the book and being here. You were talking about the health issues before, and it made me think about HIV/AIDS and your leadership on that issue. My name is Jeff Edwards. I'm a staff organizer with the faculty union here. And I think particularly for younger people, they may not be aware of how the larger society reacted to AIDS in the 1980s. It was a big opportunity for the far right, the Christian right. Californians were voting on whether to test everybody in quarantine, perhaps indefinitely. People are HIV positive, and you were out there as a leader. And I am curious, I never knew, how did you make contact with people with AIDS and commit to that work? I'm also curious to know maybe some of the inside politics in the council as you worked on that issue. People think of Chicago today as a fairly liberal town.
Yeah.
But it
wasn't then.
It wasn't. And I do want to mention, I might get all my specific facts wrong, but I think it was in 1991, ACT UP Chicago demanded that the city double its AIDS budget. Triple, thank you. And the mayor said, I'd love to do that. Show me how to do it, because we don't have the money to do it.
No,
And actually,
I don't quite remember him saying that, but go ahead. I remember him saying over my dead body, but that's another story.
What I do remember is you found the money, and so it happened, and so thank you. But I'm curious to know about how you came into that work and what it was like as an insider in the city council at that time.
Okay, so that's a good example for your question, because what happened was that, so how I got into it, I'll get to that. That's the second half of the question. I lived on Malden on the 4400 block, and on the 4500 block was the house, the first house that Chicago House started with when it was just sort of a fledgling organization. and people with AIDS lived there, and people didn't, you know, it was like really important to keep it a secret that they were there. But I used to visit all the time. I'm not sure how I found, I canvassed everywhere, so that's probably how them. It was pretty, you know, it was a pretty, and plus the hatred that was involved and everything else. It was, you know, so it was, you had to take a stand. People were so fearful, and they were fearful, this is the point about public health, they were fearful without any knowledge, so that it made it much worse. People were just scared of everybody. And use it, and some people really use it as a way to demonize anybody who was gay, let alone with AIDS. So when we, so there was, the Windy City Times was doing an editorial listing all of the information about AIDS, who had it, what was being done, how devastating it was, what could be done. And they asked me to put that into the city council. They wanted an ordinance in the budget to triple spending. And we had already passed the budget, and this was the beginning of the year, as I recall. And there were, so I met with them and a number of activists and said, sure. So let's go for it. So I said, but I'm not, I'd already done the apartheid thing, and I said, I'm not writing 17 ordinances. Let's do a resolution and force the issue and organize around the resolution. Let them write the ordinance, because they're gonna rewrite whatever I do anyway. So that's what we did. And it took a month of ACT UP, being everywhere I daily went, unfurling their ACT UP thing, to get him to tell Pat Hewells to call me and offer to co-sponsor, for him and Burke to co-sponsor the ordinance. This was, we had hearings, we did the whole bit, all the, you know, there were, but what was important about what was going on was that there was a consortium of about 50 AIDS organizations under the AIDS, what were they called? It was the AIDS Foundation. And they had just put together a blueprint for how to address the AIDS crisis. So it was simple. The reporters would say to me, once we got past how you're going to pay for it, and I would say, they know where the money is. They would say, well, who's going to do it? I mean, you're just, this is, and I'm like, that's simple. There's a whole blueprint. It was right here. They just have to implement it. So so they called me up, Hughes called me up one morning and said, can we sign on to your ordinance? And I said, sure, as soon as you write it. And we ended up, if you add the additional money that the city, the point was we were getting money from the feds and maybe even from the state, but the city wasn't putting any money into this. And we needed the city to take some responsibility, have some, you know, money in the game. So between the amount of extra money they put into it, the additional people they hired, because then they hired somebody to be in charge of it and then to have a team to do it, we tripled the spending. It took a month of ACT UP. Good example of building a sea to swim in. And that really, once Hewells and Burke went with it, which was clearly at the order of the mayor, then everyone fell in line, pretty much, except for Hagopian and a few people like that.
Thank you.
My mask has gotten stuck to my face. Let me just see if I can remove. Okay, it's not going to come off, so I'll just roll with it. I'm Anna Guevara. I'm also, I work with Gayatri on the Displacements Project. So again, on behalf of the project, wanted to thank you all for being here. I mean, so much gratitude to Helen, to Harini, and to Julie for moderating, but also wanted to give a shout out to many of our community partners on the project, some of whom are here, from Northside Action for Justice, One Northside Access Lab, and many others. And I actually want to give a shout out to Stan, who was one of our oral history narrators for a student project. Actually, I think they've shared the video with you. If not, I will share it with you, but thank you for being here. And all of you, all of our students who have worked tirelessly on many of the projects that you see back there. If you haven't seen the Uptown mural, please do take a look at it. Every piece of the artwork that is on that mural represents the life of an activist in Uptown and the organizations that have given life and history to Uptown, so please do take a look at it. It's a little fragile, so just don't touch it, but take pictures. Michael Oliveros very graciously with their father helped mount it. It's been everywhere in Uptown, so we bring it here in honor of Helen Shiller. So again, thank you very much. In Global Asian Studies, we always end our celebrations with a cake. So we have a cake in your honor, Helen. So we would like to ask Helen to move to the cake section. We will, I hope that many of you can stay. There's a bit of refreshments and also an opportunity to purchase Helen's books, but also have her sign them. So hopefully you can join us. And again, thank you. Welcome to UIC, and hope that you all have a wonderful week ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So there are two people here that I just wanted to acknowledge, San and Peter, who are from the Southeast Asia Center, who are some of the stalwarts of the social service agencies that we were talking about earlier.
So let us have cake.
So much.
Thank you.